Welcome all viewers to our channel. We are glad to see you here, where we share amazing stories from people's lives. Each of you is important to us, and we will be interested to know what country and city you are from. Please write about it in the comments. Now let's move on to our first story. Amara was born and raised in one of the city's poorest neighborhoods. This corner of the city was captivated by the noise of the streets, the smell of heavy gasoline exhaust, and the sight of old, shabby houses that had long been in need of major repairs. Pieces of cracked asphalt were illuminated by the dim light of street lamps, and the smell of dust and dampness lingered in the air. There was no greenery here. The noise of policemen was often heard in the parks, and the people, like everyone who lived here, seemed to have learned to do without joy. Amara remembered this neighborhood from her earliest childhood. She remembered walking the cramped, damp streets with her mother in search of cheap groceries, trying to stay away from groups of teenagers loudly discussing things that seemed foreign to her. But the main thing Amara remembered was the strength and perseverance of her mother, Lisa. Her mother was a woman of incredible resilience and patience who had dedicated almost her entire life to fighting to give her daughter a better life. Lisa worked at several jobs, as a cleaner in offices, as a store assistant, and sometimes in restaurants, moonlighting as a waitress. She never complained, always saying that these are the conditions and you have to live with them. Although she didn't have time for vacations, she still found moments to sit with her daughter, help her with her homework, and encourage her desire to learn. Every morning, Lisa went to work at the earliest possible time, and Amara got up afterwards so she wouldn't be late for school. There wasn't much in their home, but there was enough love to make them feel like they weren't alone in the world. Amara had been more mature than her peers since childhood. She learned early on to realize that much depended on her efforts. Sometimes Lisa would say to her, "You have to work twice as hard to get noticed. We can't afford the luxury of making a mistake." Amara, despite her youth, was keenly aware that she was not like the other kids at school. She was black, and to her peers this was unusual. There were different ethnicities in the class, but to some of the kids, black people always seemed alien, unwanted. Amara often heard conversations that began with something like, "Well, that girl," or "Are you black?" with the same looks full of curiosity and to some extent prejudice. There were few people in her childhood with whom she could feel on equal footing, without barriers between them. Sometimes on her way home from school, Amara would hear the boys in the yard teasing her, calling her dark or different. They would laugh and run around throwing hurtful phrases at her like rocks. Sometimes Amara tried to shut down, to ignore them. But one day in high school, someone told her that she would never amount to anything in life because the color of her skin was a judgment call. Nevertheless, every morning, despite the cold and dreary streets, Amara picked up her textbooks and went to school. And in the evening, despite her fatigue, sat down to do her homework, believing that one day she could change her destiny. Lisa, seeing that her daughter was becoming increasingly withdrawn, told her, "Don't pay attention to this nonsense. You don't have to justify yourself to those who don't understand you. You have a purpose, and no one can take it away from you." But Amara felt like a sip of water in the desert in those moments. She lacked peer support and understanding. She knew she was strong, but it was hard to fight it alone. Lisa often said, "We have a friend, and his name is patience. You learn it, and you will move forward while others stand still." When Amara entered high school, her life did not get any easier. Academic difficulties, constant pressure from others, social inequality, all of these things came crashing in like waves on the shore every day. The question in her mind was always, what can I do to be visible? She didn't want her life to be defined only by who she was born to be. Amara truly believed she deserved more than all the shadows that loomed over her. So when she was already 17, she decided to get a job. She looked for any place where she could earn some money and help her mother. Finding a job was not easy, but Amara was determined, and after a while she got a job at a small cafe that was located near her home. It was an unpretentious place, employing mostly teenagers and elderly people trying to make ends meet. But for Amara, it was an important event. She felt that something was beginning to change in her life. At work, she faced another reality, prejudice. But this time it was not jokes on the street, but stern looks from her colleagues and constant underestimation from her superiors. Amara immediately realized that a black girl from a poor neighborhood would be perceived differently, and she would have to work much harder to earn some respect. Every morning she came to work with one thought: I have to be strong, not let others break me. And although her job was not easy, she never gave up. She worked with heat, wiped down tables with a smile, served drinks with dignity, and, despite the hard work of the day, did not allow herself to show weakness. With each passing day, Amara realized more and more that despite the hardships, she still wanted to move forward. Despite the daily obstacles, despite the unkind stares, she was willing to fight for her dreams. She believed that one day she could achieve something more than just being a girl from a poor neighborhood whose skin color and background made her question her abilities. But sometimes, especially at night when she came home after a hard day, she couldn't get rid of the thought, what if it's all for nothing? However, each day brought her a small victory. Though she didn't yet know what would happen next, Amara had learned to be resilient. She learned to be strong, even when the whole world seemed to be against her. And perhaps that was the most important lesson she could learn from her mother and life in this cruel world. When Amara celebrated her 18th birthday, she felt that the moment had come when something had to change. The poverty she had lived since childhood and the monotony of the daily routine could no longer be her limits. She knew that despite the difficulty of this decision, she needed to leave her home neighborhood and find something more for herself. This city was too small to stay here when her heart was full of dreams of a different future. I have to step into a bigger life, Amara told herself, standing in front of the mirror in her small room. Her mother was working more and more, and she didn't have time to talk about her daughter's concerns. But Amara realized that she needed to leave so that she wouldn't be stuck in the future in this place where there were no prospects and no room for growth. She had no connections or acquaintance in the big city, but she was determined. She used her last savings to buy a bus ticket that would take her to a central part of the city she had never been to before. When she arrived, it was nothing like she had imagined. Big high-rises, lots of people, flashing police cars, and the noise of the big city were all at once tantalizing and frightening to her. Amara knew right away that it wasn't going to be easy. She struggled to find people to help her, and every step was difficult. But she didn't give up. The habit of fighting for her place in life was in her blood, and it gave her strength. Amara started looking for work and finally managed to get a job at a small cafe in the center of town. It was a modest place with cheap food, but it paid on time, and she hoped to find some stability. However, once Amara got to work, she was faced with the fact that her expectations were far from reality. The chief, a middle-aged man named Bob who ran the cafe, immediately began to see her as just another undeserving employee. Amara was a newcomer and was treated like any other working girl off the street. But unlike everyone else, Amara was easy to spot. She was black, and her differences became not just physical barriers, but social barriers that she faced on a daily basis. "Hey you, hurry up!" Bob yelled as Amara accidentally dropped the tray of cups. "Did you fall off the moon?" Amara tried to ignore his rude remarks, but it was getting harder every day. Every time she made a mistake, Bob made sarcastic comments, as if her mistakes were inevitable because of her skin color. "You probably can't even pour coffee, right?" he'd said the first time she'd messed up an order. She tried to work quickly, as efficiently as possible, but she could never escape his attacks. There was a constant feeling that she had to work twice as hard to get any respect. Sometimes she felt like all her efforts were in vain. However, Amara held on, not letting herself give up. She often went outside between shifts to calm down and get some fresh air. There was no privacy here among the tall buildings, and the city seemed to press down on her with its soulless mass. She often stood alone, wondering, why is everything so difficult? Why do I have to be so strong? But it was the feeling of loneliness that tormented Amara the most. When she returned to the cafe again and again afterwards, her heart ached with the realization that there was almost no one around her. Sometimes she would talk to the other cafe workers. Those were from different walks of life, but more often than not, they were strangers to her. They were each going through their own struggles, each absorbed in their own problems, and no one tried to support or listen. She was alone, and that was the worst feeling of all. One day when it was raining so hard you couldn't see the sky, Amara forgot to bring an umbrella and got soaked on the way to the cafe. Working all day, she felt the cold creeping into her bones, and her legs could hardly move with fatigue. The chief didn't even notice her condition, for he was too busy to offer any sympathy. He scolded her when she didn't get her order in on time, but the words he spoke cut like a knife. "You're here to work, not rest. You've got legs, so move," Bob kept saying. The next week, when she finally made it through the day, Amara got up late at night to return to the dormitory once again. Suddenly, one of the cafe's regular customers, an older man in a suit with kind eyes, appeared in her path. He was sitting in a corner, and noticing her tired eyes, he asked, "Are you having a hard time?" Amara flinched, not expecting the question from an outsider, but answered immediately, "Yeah, it's just a loss of work." The man was silent for a moment, then said, "You're not alone. Sometimes this world seems harsh, but you are strong. You need to remember that." Those words warmed Amara more than she could have expected. She didn't know who the man was, but his words made her believe a little in the best. At night, as she lay on the hard bed of the dormitory, Amara couldn't get the encounter with him out of her mind. "Maybe I really need to start believing in myself despite all the hardships," she thought. It wasn't easy for her, but she knew that this moment was only temporary. She had to keep moving forward despite her fatigue and loneliness. With each step, despite the pain and disappointments, she was learning to be strong. Life in the big city was brutal, but Amara couldn't stop. She realized that this was the path she had to take, and that the only strength she could rely on was the strength within herself. With each step, she became more determined, and loneliness became her friend and source of inner strength. Meanwhile, inside the cafe where she continued to work, the situation was becoming increasingly tense. But Amara knew that despite all the difficulties, she was ready to fight. Amara woke up in the early morning when the city was just beginning to come alive. The light of the streets barely filtered through the dirty windows, and memories, vivid and painful, surfaced amidst the bustle of the morning, in which she was once again lost. Sometimes they came without warning, like ghosts from the pieces, cutting off her thoughts at the most inappropriate moment. That day, when she was about 8 years old, was the first time she felt the cold stare of loneliness and strangeness on her. It was an ordinary school day, a morning full of anticipation and anxiety before a new lesson. Everyone was sitting at their desks as usual, some drawing, some reading. But for Amara, there was nothing ordinary about this moment. Then she noticed how one of the boys in her class, large and with insolent eyes, suddenly turned to her and said loudly, "Why are you so black? You definitely don't need to be in our class." The laughter of his friends was like laughter from hell. That moment cut into the little girl's heart like a knife. She didn't understand why she had to be anything different, why her skin color was a reason for ridicule. But despite her confusion, Amara didn't say a word in response. Then, as in so many other situations, she chose to remain silent. Lisa, her mother, had taught her not to pay attention to those who were not worthy of your attention. When the girl returned home, Lisa noticed that her daughter was silent and depressed. She had never been used to hiding her emotions, but something was wrong that day. "What's wrong, Amara?" Lisa asked, gently closing the door to their small kitchen. Amara just shook her head and sat silently on the couch, avoiding her mother's gaze. Lisa watched her carefully, realizing that she would hear the girl's words one way or another. "It doesn't matter, Mom," Amara finally said, barely holding back tears. "They're laughing at me." Lisa sat down next to her and hugged her daughter. She knew Amara would face this more and more each year, but she couldn't bear to watch her daughter lose her faith in herself to other people's looks and cruel words. "Amara, you're my pride. You're strong. You have to remember that, even when people tell you something different. This world may be cruel, but your resilience will be more important." Despite her mother's warm words, Amara felt lonely. She couldn't understand why her skin color was a reason for other people to ridicule her, why she should be judged for it. And even when Lisa said she was strong, Amara could feel her self-esteem melting with each cruel word. Over the years, as Amara grew older, this loneliness became her constant companion. In high school, the situation did not improve. She faced ridicule, not only from her peers, but also from adults. One of the most painful moments was when a teacher who taught literature once during class, while discussing different cultural backgrounds, called her a girl from a poor neighborhood who will never understand what real culture is. This teacher's words were harsh and unfair, but Amara, despite her inner storm, only lowered her eyes and did not respond. At times, she had to close herself in the bathroom and hide her tears because she couldn't allow herself to be weak. She couldn't allow those around her to see how much she was hurting for their words. Even Lisa, despite her steadfastness and love, sometimes didn't have the words to comfort her daughter. Amara felt that she was alone on this journey and that she alone could handle this burden. All of those memories filled her again as she stood in the cafe, watching Bob sarcastically throw remarks at her over and over again, oblivious to his hypocrisy. He looked at her as mere labor, a tool, not a person. But despite this, Amara kept working. She always kept her emotions in check, remained impassive so as not to give Bob an excuse to humiliate her again. Every day she realized more and more that these shadows of the past, these hurtful words, could no longer control her life. They could hurt, but they had no power over her future. She was ready to put all those memories behind her and move forward, no matter what others said, no matter how hard it was for her to deal with the fact that the world was sometimes cruel to her. All she could control was her own future. Sometimes when she walked past the mirror, she could feel that pain still living inside her. But also in the mirror, she saw a strong girl who was learning to overcome her pain, learning to ignore the looks and words that could once have broken her. Her face was more confident now, and determination burned in her eyes. "I won't let them break me," she whispered to herself. Although she often felt that the world was not ready to accept her, she no longer feared loneliness. She had already endured so much: rejection, ridicule, scorn. She could handle it because deep down she knew that her strength was not in giving in, but in continuing to fight. In the memories of facing cruel words and actions, Amara found her resilience. She learned to face her fears and loneliness, realizing that it did not define her. The realization grew in her soul that despite others' cruelty, she was worthy of happiness and respect. And one day this world, as well as all people, would learn to see her not through the prism of stereotypes, but who she really was. With each step, despite the loneliness and pain, she grew stronger. And this was only the beginning of her journey. Amara didn't know why it felt like the whole world was against her that night. She sat at the counter, wiping down tables, listening to the rain drumming relentlessly outside the window. The whole day had been an awful hassle: endless orders, Bob's angry remarks, disgruntled customers who didn't see her as a person, only as an attendant. Even her thoughts began to jumble. It seemed that everything she did was not just pointless, but truly outdated, insignificant. Over the years of working at the cafe, Amara felt more and more like a small part of her soul was leaving. When her shift was over, the rain, as luck would have it, had only gotten heavier. Amara wiped her hands with a towel that showed the grease from her meal and traces of coffee and headed for the exit. The cafe was empty, and the last chime of the door as she stepped outside seemed particularly sharp, like the final chord in an ominous symphony of the day. She stepped out onto the sidewalk, and immediately the rain began to pour down on her with such force that it seemed as if the entire city had suddenly disappeared, leaving only this endless wall of water. Amara reached into her pocket, but not finding an umbrella, she inwardly cursed. It was one of those days when everything went wrong. It was as if her whole life, every addition of her daily hopes, had come to a standstill. The city, as before, was huge and cold. The light from the street lights reflected dimly off the wet sidewalks, giving the whole view an unnatural nastiness. She could feel the water rushing to her bones, and the slippery puddles beneath her feet made her move slowly and cautiously. This rain wasn't just rain. It felt like life itself was dumping obstacles on her, preventing her from moving forward. Each step through the streets became more and more difficult. Amara's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, like an unstoppable stream that wouldn't give her a break. Yesterday, she had thought that things would get better, that her life wouldn't constantly seem like a trap that she found herself in every time she tried to believe in the best. But now she felt that her path had become straight, too straight for her liking. Why is this all happening to me? Over and over again, the questions sounded in her head. Disappointment from relationships at work, her struggle with her inner demons, as if on the verge of a breakdown, and misunderstanding from others. All this did not let go. The inability to find her place in a huge city where no one was willing to accept her as an equal filled Amara's soul with bitterness. She was tired, tired of fighting, tired of every new step forward being accompanied by a new disappointment. No matter how hard she tried, it was as if the world kept pushing her backward. She didn't notice when she stepped on the slippery tiles, lost her balance, and suddenly found herself on the ground. The wet earth dug into her skin, the wet asphalt staining her clothes. It wasn't just a fall, it was a fall into the very abyss of despair. Tears were almost near, but she held them back. She could feel the strong wind and rain making her even more vulnerable. The passers-by running by didn't notice her. People around them were busy with their own worries, not paying attention to someone else's pain, as if she was just a part of this rainy day. Someone even passed by and laughed when they saw her trying to get up. But there was no resentment or rage on her soul, just emptiness. These moments felt like something inevitable, like another stroke in the picture of her life. She tried to stand up again, but at that moment the ground beneath her seemed to go away, and she almost fainted from fatigue. Her hands slipped on the muddy path, and suddenly she felt something cold and wet. It wasn't just rain, it was the feeling of the world's complete indifference to her pain. Only in that moment did she realize that all her life she had been part of this inevitability, part of a society that didn't understand that her personal struggle, despite her skin color, her poverty, and her life, was a true struggle for existence. And no one could help her because no one was willing to see her true pain. Amara looked up and saw several people standing in front of her, one of whom, a middle-aged man, looked at her with sympathy. But he was not the one who could help her at this moment. He only offered his hand as a symbol that someone understood her suffering. She took his hand, struggled to her feet, and her gaze met his eyes. He didn't say anything. Amara just nodded to him, gratefully silent. She was so tired she couldn't utter a word. But every look he gave her said that at least this moment, when someone was willing to help, was important. Afterward, they stood silently in the rain, and the world seemed to stand still. The wet clothes, the cold wind, the gray clouds, it was all part of her current world. But in the back of her mind, Amara felt that this was not the end. At that moment, something in her heart suddenly fluttered, as if she suddenly realized she hadn't lost herself yet. She wouldn't be alone forever. But before she returned to her small, empty house to sit in the dark room again, she knew her struggle was not over. Every day she would get up again, and when morning came, it would be brighter than yesterday. "Tomorrow will be different," Amara whispered quietly to herself, looking at the raindrops running down the windows. But she couldn't help but feel that tomorrow she would have to fight again. Amara walked down the street, shivering in the rain under her hood, trying not to drown in her own thoughts. She still couldn't get the words that echoed in her head like an ominous echo out of her head. Everything she had experienced that day was like a wave rolling over and over again. A sense of hopelessness came over her like a thick fog. Not even the cold rain drumming against her body could comfort her. It had been a couple hours since she had left the cafe, and she was tired of walking home. The street was deserted and seemed even more gloomy than usual. Only car headlights and dim lights created the only sources of light in this darkened world. Amara was in her own world, not paying attention to the puddles that had formed on the road, not noticing how her footsteps slid on the wet tiles. And that's when it all happened. It was so fast that she didn't even realize she was on the ground. First, her foot stumbled on a slippery patch of sidewalk and nearly broke. And then, before she could get her footing, she lost her balance. The next moment, she felt her body absorb the dirt, as if the earth itself had decided to take her into its dark depths. She fell, hitting her knees on the cold asphalt. And then her whole body literally sank into a huge puddle of mud and debris. Amara, as if swallowed by the swamp, found herself in the very center of this humiliating and painful fall. The water, mixed with mud, enveloped her, penetrated her clothes, soaking her to the very bones. She felt the invisible hands of this filthy substance reaching for her, engulfing her in this humiliating position. Amara tried to get up, but every movement she made only made things worse. The mud was sticky, dragging, and her legs seemed unsteady, as if the ground was holding her down, preventing her from standing up. At times, even her breathing became labored, as if she was trying to climb out of the abyss itself. Her face was now caked with dirt, and even her eyes could barely open. This sticky state made her feel as if her body was glued to the ground, as if the whole world had become one big blur in which she was simply disappearing. Bitterness appeared on her lips, and resentment clenched in her chest, resentment at herself. How could she have been so careless, so vulnerable? How could she let life topple her into this abyss again? She knew that every fall was a chance to start over, but in this moment she felt no strength. Her body was so tired and her soul so exhausted that this pain seemed familiar and inevitable. At that moment, Amara felt something hot rise up inside her. It wasn't a tear, but a kind of unknowable force that made her grit her teeth, push herself up off the ground, and try to climb out. She didn't want to be this wet, dirty figure, forgotten and humiliated. But no matter how hard she tried, that fall was leaving a mark in her body and soul. From afar, someone noticed her. The passerby, unhurriedly, with a kind of indifference, continued on his way, turning his eyes aside. But not all people were so indifferent. Suddenly, Amara felt someone coming toward her. At first, it was hard to focus on that person, but the next moment she realized that someone was holding out a hand. "Hey, are you okay?" the man asked. His voice sounded concerned, but his face remained aloof. Amara couldn't even respond. She didn't have the strength. More by instinct than by choice, she took his hand and stood up. Her body seemed to respond to her movements, and the pain in her knees, back, and head receded, but her eyes were still a mist of water. Amara looked around quickly and felt the emptiness fill her soul again. "It happened again," she whispered to herself. "Here I am again, in the mud, just like always. No one understands me. No one can help me." The passerby looked at her with interest, but before he could say anything, he turned and walked away without waiting to find out what had happened. Amara wasn't angry, though she was hurt and resentful. This world wasn't one to place importance on everyone. Those around her were busy with their own concerns, and she understood that. But deep down, there was a desperate feeling that no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't change this world, couldn't make it see her true worth. Courageously, despite her dirty clothes and cold, swollen hands, Amara continued on her way. It wasn't just moving forward, it was moving toward herself, toward her pain and despair. She was willing to accept that falling was not the end, and that she would be stronger with each such moment. All she had to do was believe in herself. The dirt on her body, the cold in her bones, none of it defined her life. She was more than her falls, more than the dirt on her skin. And she knew that despite all the humiliation and the hard moments, she must not let them break her. There would always be dirt in this world, but she didn't have to drown in it. "I'll be stronger tomorrow," she whispered, as she continued to walk through the rain, wiping her eyes from the water mixed with her last tears. Amara stood up from the ground and felt the cold wind blowing through her. It was still raining, and now her clothes were soaked through, and her body was tired and heavy. But the feeling of emptiness inside was even more oppressive. She took a few tentative steps, trying to get up and put her pain behind her, when suddenly laughter erupted around her. It wasn't just laughter, it was mocking, cruel, and cynical mirth that cut through the air like a knife. Amara froze. She couldn't immediately recognize where the sound was coming from. She tried to focus, but there was too much chaos in her head. She tried to ignore the laughter, but it grew louder and sharper as it echoed in her ears. And that's when she realized they were laughing at her. She looked around. Several men were standing nearby, and their looks were full of mockery. One of them was holding a cell phone and swaggeringly filming her. Her situation was becoming more humiliating by the moment. She stood in puddles of mud, shivering from the cold, and the people around her. Not only were they not helping, they were turning her pain into a spectacle. "Look at the black creature wallowing in the mud," came one of the voices, whose laughter grew louder and louder. Amara felt a wave of heat run up her spine, as if her inner heat was fighting the cold coming from outside. She felt the man's every word cutting into her soul. She couldn't believe what was happening. It was the moment when all her hopes and dreams, all her efforts to find her place in the world, had collapsed in an instant. The audience continued to laugh. Some people even began to move closer, not only to watch, but also to banter with her. It was as if this was the norm, as if she wasn't a person, but just an object for their amusement. Every look, every laugh, Every derogatory word pierced her heart. "Oh, she's mud herself now. Not that there's anything to do here at all," someone else said, his voice filled with contempt. Amara stood there, unable to move. Her legs wouldn't listen. She felt something clench in her chest. It wasn't just coldness, it was resentment. She wasn't prepared for something like this. She didn't think people could be so cruel. They weren't just ignoring her, they were turning her suffering into something ridiculous, lifeless. And now, as she stood in this abomination, surrounded by cruel glances and taunts, one thought possessed her completely. They don't see me. They don't see me as a human being. They only saw her as a black girl to be humiliated. They didn't realize that behind her every look, behind her every move, was a life of pain and struggle. They didn't know that she, like all of them, longed to be noticed and accepted. But in that moment, it was hard for her to believe it. Amara felt her hands begin to tremble and her lips immediately pressed together into a thin line. But she couldn't let herself cry. No, she wouldn't cry. She would not give these people what they wanted. She was not weak. She would not fall before them. But every word, every laugh hurt her like 1,000 needles. And despite that, she still couldn't take away the burning feeling that gripped her from the inside. The laughter continued. The camera kept recording. It wasn't just humiliation. It was humiliation with every second, with every look. This was the moment when Amara wasn't just falling. She was being victimized by an entire society that was willing to watch her lose everything she could. How could she have been so vulnerable? Why didn't these people realize what they were doing? Why was everything she'd been through just a laughing matter to them? She thought of her mother, of all the hardships she'd had to go through. But how could she explain to this world that her life wasn't just a show? That her struggles were not just entertainment for others? This made the thought of her loneliness even more obvious. She stood there, engulfed in her filth and humiliation, unable to shake off the feeling that she was alone in the world. Her fear was so great that she didn't know how to find the strength to fight. Every laugh, every cruel look cut off everything that had once been bright from her. It was like she was a little girl again, being knocked down all the time, never given a chance. But suddenly, in the midst of all this unbearable pain, one man approached her. It was an old man, and there was no mockery in his eyes. He leaned toward her quietly and, without a word, gave her his hand. Without realizing what she was doing, Amara took his hand and felt something important begin to happen. The gesture was simple, but there was more to it than one would realize at first glance. He wasn't the one who laughed. He was someone who remembered that a man was worthy of respect, regardless of everything. The old man helped her up, but Amara could feel the pain in her chest not going away. She wiped the dirt from her face, raised her head, and looked at the people around her. But she didn't say a word. She simply walked past, feeling that her soul had been shaken by this cruelty and that she could not leave it behind now. But a spark was lit inside her, a spark that maybe in the future would give her the strength not only to fight for herself, but also for those who suffer as she did. When she left, the laughter seemed to continue, but her footsteps grew more confident. Because Amara knew one thing: no amount of ridicule or scorn can break someone who finds the strength to move on, no matter what. Amara stood on the wet sidewalk, her eyes staring into the void as the abuse continued around her. There was a sense of hopelessness in her chest, and the world seemed so alien and cruel. The laughter behind her continued, penetrating her consciousness more and more with each passing moment. She felt her strength draining away, and how hard it was to just stand there, not answering, not doing anything. Everything inside her was shattered. How could life have brought her to this point? Why did people allow themselves to humiliate others so easily? And at this moment, when Amara no longer expected help, when her pain was almost unbearable, she felt something strange. A thin but determined voice cut through that ocean of taunts. "Stop it!" he shouted, and instantly all eyes turned to the newcomer to the scene. Amara slowly turned her head. From the crowd she had barely noticed, an old man appeared. He was an elderly black man. His face was haggard with time, but his eyes, there was strength in his eyes, incredible kindness and confidence. He wasn't young and he wasn't full of energy like the other passersby, but there was something about him that drew attention. He stood a few steps away from her, his figure firm, as if his entire life experience had been compressed into this one moment. He wasn't looking at Amara with pity, not judging, not trying to understand what had happened. He was here because he felt he had to help. It was as if his soul was connected to hers, and he couldn't pass it by. "Get out of here," he said, turning to the group of people who were still laughing and filming. "You have no business being here. Don't make fun of her anymore." The passers-by, who not long ago had been laughing and discussing her fall, were now somewhat silent, but not all of them. Some continued to hold up their phones, while others unashamedly addressed the taunts. "It's just a black fool in the mud," one of the men threw in. "Who is she to get in our way?" But the old man didn't hesitate. He stepped closer, and with every movement he made, he could feel a kind of strength growing in the air, a strength he had carried with him through years of struggle. He stepped toward Amara and, without a word, put his hand on her shoulder. "Go away," he repeated, his voice as hard as stone. "You boy, you girl, if you have nothing sensible to say, you'd better not say anything at all." His words were weighty, and if the crowd had laughed and jeered before, now it froze. People began to avert their eyes, not knowing how to react to this unexpected turn of events. Those who had been laughing a second ago now realized that the old man had stopped them for a reason. He stood there with such determination that their laughter seemed pathetic and unnecessary. One by one, the mockers began to retreat. Some quietly turned off the camera, others shook their heads and walked away without saying a word. Soon all that was left around Amara was an empty street and a silence that was almost palpable. But the old man did not stop. He continued to stand beside her, his eyes full of concern and involvement. He covered her from the rain with his cloak. His clothes were old, but his movements were so quick and decisive that Amara felt that this figure beside her gave her a protection she could not even dream of. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly, looking into her eyes. Amara looked up at him. There was still despair in her eyes, and her heart remained broken. But the old man's gaze was so simple and sincere that her soul was suddenly filled with light. I don't know," she replied, her voice shaking with emotion. He smiled softly, and that smile was so peaceful that it filled Amara with a feeling she hadn't felt in a long time. "Hope. It's going to be okay," he said. "You're not alone." And those words, so simple, so sincere, became like water dripping onto dried earth, bringing it back to life. Amara felt tears begin to pool in her eyes, but she didn't shy away from them. The tears weren't tears of humiliation. They weren't tears of pain. They were tears of relief. She was not alone. Someone had come to her, and that person wasn't judging her, wasn't laughing at her, wasn't trying to leave like everyone else. He was here for her. He turned out to be the man she'd been looking for so long. "You're a good man," she said through her tears, her voice still shaking, but now there was strength in it. "Thank you." The old man nodded and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "That's all I can do," he replied. "Don't let them take your power. You deserve more than they can imagine. You are important." Those words were like a balm to her soul, like the comfort Amara had been missing for so long. She remembered her mother, her dreams, and her struggles. Though the world remained just as cruel, this moment was a turning point. In that moment, she felt that she was not alone, that someone believed in her after all. This was what she had been searching for her whole life, to realize that she was worthy of something more. The old man continued to stand beside her, and his silence was as powerful as his words. He was a man who, by his presence, had already changed everything. Though she couldn't understand why he was here at this moment, she knew one thing: his kindness and strength had helped her regain her confidence. They stood in the rain, and that moment was the beginning of a new path for her. A path where, despite all the evil and pain, she could be strong because now she had someone to support her. And that support was more important than anything else in the world. "Thank you," she said again, and this time her voice sounded more confident. The old man smiled again, nodding his head. Amara knew that she would not forget this moment. It was the moment she had been searching for in her life, a moment of strength and kindness that made her believe there was light in this world, despite all the dark and cruel things she had encountered. There was a long road ahead, but with each step she knew she would be strong. And this man with a kind heart became an example to her of how, even in the darkest moments, you can find light. "You'll make it," he said one last time before they parted. You deserve to be happy." And she moved on. Amara stood in the rain's embrace, but the rain didn't seem so cold to her now. When the old man placed his hand on her shoulder, it seemed that with him came more than just protection from the cold. His presence filled her not only with warmth, but with an inestimable peace of mind, as if her mental wounds had begun to heal, barely touched by his kindness. They stood in silence for several minutes. All the noise of the city, the streetlights, the wet sidewalks, and the sound of the rain were distant and almost insignificant. All she could feel was his confidence, which was transmitted to her like an invisible thread that connected them. His gaze was so calm and wise that Amara didn't feel the need to say anything right away. She just stood there, letting him be there, and that was all she needed at that moment. Finally, the old man broke the silence. "Don't be afraid," he said, his voice soft, but there was genuine strength in it. "Life isn't as cruel as it may seem if you know how to look at it. I've been through a lot myself, believe me. We are all like rivers flowing our own way. Sometimes we have to fight the rocks, and sometimes we have to fight the water itself that tries to carry us away. But it's important not to forget what you're fighting for. Never let others tell you that you are not important." As Amara listened to him, she felt something change inside. Those simple words sounded as if they were opening a new path before her that she had not even thought of. The old man's words penetrated her heart, filling her with new strength. "But how do you not break when it feels like the whole world is against you?" she asked quietly. Her voice was shaky, but it was no longer as painful as it had been before. It was more open, as if after a long silence. He chuckled softly, but his eyes were serious. "I know how it is. When I was younger, I too felt like the whole world was against me. Pain, betrayal, despair. I went through it all. But what I've learned is that every blow, every setback makes us stronger if we let them teach us. You don't want to be the one who gives up, do you?" Amara thought for a moment. She tried to understand how such simple words could change her perception so much. She could feel his words penetrating her heart and setting things straight. The world wouldn't be so cruel if she learned to see it from a different perspective. "You're right," she said, gradually feeling her inner world fill with something light. "I just need to learn to be strong. I can't let others define my worth." The old man nodded, his eyes full of understanding. "You're already strong, Amara. Sometimes we don't see our own strength because we are so often hurt and humiliated. But believe me, everyone has inner strength. He who can fight his own demons can conquer anything." Those words seemed to penetrate to the very core of her existence. It was a moment of insight for Amara, as if she was only now beginning to realize how much effort she had put into her survival. How many times she had risen despite the blows of fate. How many times she had fought the same inner demons the old man had spoken of. "But what do you do when everything seems so dark?" she asked. "How do you go on when you have no strength?" "Then we must look for light in the darkest places," he answered, his voice full of wisdom. "Light is not always bright. It may be barely visible, like a small spark in the night. But if you find it and walk toward it, it will grow brighter." Amara closed her eyes and for a moment felt her body relax. She felt something very important. Her value. And that value didn't depend on what others said, on their ridicule or their looks. She was important simply because she existed, because she had been through so much, and she had not given up. The old man continued to speak, his words full of strength, but also of tenderness, as if he knew that she, despite everything, did not yet believe in herself completely. But he was ready to remind her that believing in herself was what mattered most. "You'll get through this," he said. "The hardships you're going through don't define you. You will dissect who you are. Don't let anyone take away your power." Her eyes filled with tears, but now they were tears not of despair, but of understanding. She was not alone, and perhaps this was the most important discovery of her life. The old man, this man with a kind heart, had changed her. His simple words, his help in this moment, had been a light in a dark world. When he noticed her tears, he gently placed his hand on her shoulder. "Don't be afraid to cry," he said. "It is not a sign of weakness, but a sign that you are living, and you will live." Amara smiled through her tears. Those words were what she had been missing. She felt her heart fill with warmth and peace. This wasn't the end of her journey, this was a new stage of it. a stage where she could look at herself and the world with new strength and confidence. "Thank you," she said, her voice full of gratitude. The old man nodded. "I'm always here if you need me. But remember, you're already strong, and this world needs your strength." With those words, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the rain. Amara stood watching him go and felt something in her soul change. She was ready to keep going, despite everything that had happened. There was warmth in her heart now, and that warmth was with her wherever she went. When Amara returned home after the old man helped her, the world was not the same. Everything that had happened that night had suddenly become the center of discussion online. The event she had experienced with such shame and pain was now the center of attention for thousands of people. A video of the incident taken by a passerby quickly went viral. Thousands of comments began to gather under it, making her story famous. Amara sat in her small room and her heart clenched when she saw the first message. "Watch this black girl fall in the mud. Just a disgrace," the caption to the video read. Her eyes darkened and her thoughts began to jumble. She hadn't expected her pain to be so open to the world. At first, she was overwhelmed with shame and humiliation, as if she was standing in a puddle again and the people around her were laughing. But soon, something in her Yurdzala began to change. A few minutes passed and another message appeared. Then another. People started defending her. Words of support began to appear under the video. Some people just couldn't believe that someone could be so cruel to a person in a difficult situation. "God, how can you make fun of a person who is in trouble?" one user wrote. "I understand people can be cruel, but how can you film something like this without offering to help?" With each new message, the wave of support for Amara grew. People began to openly condemn those who filmed what was happening, criticizing them for their cruelty and indifference. It wasn't just a video, it was something that touched the hearts of many. Soon there were posts with hashtags that called for unity and support. Hashtag stand with Amara, hashtag stop racism, hash help others. Amara felt the weight that had been on her shoulders move away a little with each refresh of the page. A wonderful feeling was arising in her heart. The fear and shame she had been feeling began to melt away, and in their place came an unsure but increasingly strong belief in herself. People supported her, and her story was not just a story of humiliation. It became a story of strength and support. Soon a post by a blogger who was an active defender of human rights appeared on social media. He took the initiative to ask subscribers to help people in such situations and called for respect and humanity. His video said, "These people who were laughing and filming what was happening forgot the most important thing. A person who is in trouble should not be an object of ridicule." At times like this, support and sympathy are more important than ever. But look how people responded to this video. They supported the girl, even if her situation previously seemed ridiculous to them. And that's remarkable. We have to remember that behind every video on the internet is a real person. Amara became more and more famous every day. Her name became a symbol of the fight against indifference and racism. Although her presence on social media was not something planned, she gradually learned to accept this new reality. People continued to write her words of support, but now they were not just abstract comments, but proof that she was not alone. But there was also the other face of the coin. As much as it was nice to feel supported, it was difficult and painful to read those comments that still tried to justify the behavior of those who made fun of her. That girl was just supposed to not fall in a puddle. Why get so upset? There are troubles in life, one user wrote. There was a sense of incomprehension and indifference in such messages, and Amara couldn't help but notice them. She sat in her house, tired from all the messages, but still realizing it wasn't empty noise. Her spirit grew stronger with each comment. She smiled more and more often, and this new experience was a lesson to her. The world was far from being as black and white as she had once thought. "Did you see what they wrote about you?" her mom asked, sitting next to her. Amara nodded. "I saw," she answered, a little tired but clear-eyed. "I didn't think it would turn out like this, but now I know that people can be supportive. I didn't even expect there were so many good people in the world." Her mom took her hand and squeezed it tightly. "You're strong, Amara. You'll learn to deal with this. We all do. I'm proud of you." Her words made Amara's heart touch. Yes, she was proud of herself, but not because she had become a hero, but because she had learned to look at the world with a new perspective. She had stopped being a victim. She was now an example of strength. Day after day, people continued to discuss what had happened. Newspapers, news programs, even community activists raised the topic of racism, indifference, and the importance of helping those in distress. Even those who had previously doubted realized that such an incident should not be repeated. The community appeared ready for change. But the most important thing Amara realized was that she was no longer alone in her journey. She read many posts and comments, and with each passing day she realized that those who judged or laughed at her had lost their humanity, and she, on the contrary, had gained new strength. And now her journey was not just someone who had experienced pain, but someone who was able to inspire others not to be silent or look away when injustice happens. Amara wasn't looking for fame, but she knew her life had changed forever. And now, despite everything she'd been through, she was ready to move forward, knowing she wasn't alone. Life went on, but now she could see so much more in it, the sympathy, understanding, and support she deserved. Despite all the events that had shaken her, Amara wasn't about to let the incident ruin her life. Yes, that night had been a painful lesson for her, but it had also been the starting point from which her new life began. Amara knew she couldn't allow herself to wallow in self-pity. She wasn't weak, she was a strong woman who had been through too much to dwell on one moment. Soon after her story went viral, Amara began receiving messages she wouldn't have expected. She received several job offers ranging from restaurants to a small marketing company that was looking for new employees. These offers weren't huge, but they opened up new opportunities for her that she couldn't have imagined before. One of the proposals came from a small cafe located in the city center. It was a place that attracted young people, students, and tourists. They were looking for someone who could work as a waiter and who would bring to their team not only the ability to work, but also warmth of heart. Amara knew this was her chance. She wasn't sure if everything would be perfect, but she was ready to fight for her new life. In addition to job offers, she also received several messages from people who wanted to support her. One of these people was a blogger who was active in highlighting issues of racism and social injustice. He suggested that she meet and discuss opportunities to collaborate so that her story could help others who were facing similar challenges. He was willing to give her a platform where she could talk about her experiences and be a voice for those who couldn't speak up. Amara didn't expect to find people willing to support her so quickly. She was touched, but she also felt fear. Fear that she would fail, that her life would once again become part of someone else's play. But that fear couldn't stop her. She had already been through too much to back down now. Her days became filled with new worries and troubles. She went on interviews, looked for a job, and talked to people who believed in her. She met with a blogger and discussed how her story could be used to help others. This process seemed difficult and unfamiliar, but it was empowering for Amara. She felt like her life was back in her hands, and now she could move forward without looking back. One evening after a hard day, Amara was sitting on her old couch looking at her phone. She opened up social media again and saw a post from the old man who had helped her that evening. He wrote about the importance of supporting each other and how sometimes small actions can make a huge difference. The post included a picture of her and him meeting. Amara felt gratitude and warmth fill her heart. These words weren't just well wishes, they were a reminder that she wasn't alone in this world. And perhaps that support itself was more important than anything else. She texted him, thanking him for everything he'd done for her. It didn't take long for him to reply. "Don't forget, Amara, that you are strong. You've been through a lot, and you'll keep moving forward. Believe in yourself. You are not alone." Those words, so simple yet full of power, were the very light in her life that she was looking for. Soon she decided to take the next step. She accepted an offer to work in a cafe. The first day was full of excitement. Meeting a new team, she realized that she had a lot to learn and a lot to adapt. But in the eyes of her colleagues, including students and young professionals, she felt supported. She was not judged. She was not seen as an outsider. She was part of this world, and they were there to help. As she worked, Amara realized that not only was she learning to be part of a team, but she was also growing as a person. Gradually, her confidence began to grow. People who came to the cafe noticed her smile, her caring attitude towards each customer. Even though it was just a cafe, it became something more for her. It became a place where she felt needed and important. Every night when she returned home, she felt her heart fill with gratitude. She was no longer the lost girl who had fallen into the mud a few months ago and felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. No, now she was Amara, a woman who had been through the pain and had come out of it with the strength to keep going. One day when she came home from work, she saw a message on her phone from a blogger she was dating. He suggested she make a video to talk about her journey and the importance of seeking support and not being afraid to be herself. Amara said yes. This was her chance to be a voice for others. She realized that her story could help many, and so began her new life. It was a journey full of challenges and opportunities, but Amara knew that now she had everything she needed to not just survive, but to live. The life of the old man who helped Amara began to change from the moment the video of the incident went viral. His kind act caught the attention not only of Amara, but also of hundreds of people who were worried about her plight and condemned the indifference of passers-by. Soon his name became known in the neighborhood and his life, filled with quiet everyday life and work, began to change. The man everyone now called Uncle James had always been a man who preferred to remain in the shadows. He didn't seek recognition and was never the center of attention. However, his act was the turning point that opened up new horizons for him. With each passing day, his story was told on the local news and he became a local celebrity. He was not just an old man helping a girl in a difficult situation. He became a symbol of human kindness and compassion. James never sought popularity, but his simple words and actions touched people's hearts. His story has acquired a symbolic meaning, showing that in a world full of indifference and cruelty, there is room for love, support, and mercy. I am not a hero, he often said in interviews. I am just a man who could not pass by when he saw suffering. And yet, it was in these words that the true power of his act was hidden, not exaggeration, but sincere humanity. As time went on, Uncle James began to receive inquiries from people who wanted to hear his story. Many of them were young people, looking for a mentor who could give them faith in a brighter future, in the light of the human soul, despite the darkness they often see around them. Many of them had grown up in difficult circumstances, faced ridicule, prejudice, and violence. And now they were looking for someone who could understand and support them. Uncle James was a man with a lot of life experience. He lived many years in the neighborhood, saw many tragedies and joys, and saw how fickle and sometimes unfair society can be. But his life was filled with respect for people, caring and understanding. He knew that people, no matter their background or color, all strive for love and acceptance. He learned an important lesson. If you want to make this world a better place, you must first do something for others. His lessons became truly valuable to those who were looking for support in dark moments. One evening, as he sat on the old wooden porch of his house, he received a call from one of the local teenagers who often passed by his house. Previously, the guy hadn't noticed James as he passed by, but now, after hearing about his act, wondered if he could be his mentor. James smiled and agreed. Come, I'll tell you how important it is to always remain a human being, how important it is to help, even if you don't get recognition for it. Everything you do must come from the heart. With each new instruction, James felt like his life was being filled with meaning. He didn't know how much longer he would live, but he was sure that every day he would spend helping others was a day worth living. Gradually, his influence in the neighborhood grew. James started organizing meetings for local teenagers, where they could talk about their problems and share their worries. He taught them important things: how not to give up, how to fight poverty and social injustice, how not to give in to provocations and not to follow stereotypes. He taught them to love themselves, to respect others, and to realize that every difficult moment is followed by a silver lining. When James began to hold these meetings, he noticed that the young people were responding to what he was saying. And if at first they didn't understand why they were doing it, they soon began to change their attitude toward life. He became not only a mentor, but also a friend, a man who knew what suffering was, but who still believed in goodness and humanity. One of the teenagers, Jacob, who had begun to frequent these meetings, confided to James after one of the talks, I always thought people were the way they are, and you can't change the world. But you've shown me that it's up to us. We can be kind, we can help, we can make a difference in our lives. You taught me to believe that everything is possible. Those words were a real reward for James. He felt that everything he had done was not in vain. Every day he became more and more sure that he belonged here, among these people, among those who needed support and love. He was ready to continue this work despite all the difficulties and obstacles. One day after one of the meetings, James decided to write a letter to Amara. He thanked her for being a part of his life, for giving him this chance to be a mentor. You, Amara, have become my inspiration. Your strength, your resilience keeps me moving forward. You have taught me that no matter how hard things get, the most important thing is to not give up and to help those around you. Amara, after reading this letter, felt her heart fill with pride. Uncle James wasn't just someone who had saved her in that moment. He was the one who inspired her to change and helped her to believe in the power of kindness and mutual aid. In his face, Amara saw the light she had been searching for in her own journey, a light that can pierce even the darkest moments and that gives faith in people. Amara realized that her life story, like James's, was part of a bigger and more important story about how love and kindness can change the world. And now they both knew that it didn't matter how many obstacles were in the way. If you stayed true to your principles, you could be the one to change your life and the lives of others. Amara stood at the window of her new apartment, eyes fixed on the nighttime city. This was her new beginning. The city that had once seemed like an endless maze to her now looked like a place where anything was possible. Amara was ready to begin this journey, despite any difficulties that might still come her way. Her life had changed dramatically since that awful evening when she had fallen into the mud and become the object of ridicule. It was the beginning of her long journey to finding herself, and though each step seemed difficult, she felt something important growing inside her. She realized that her strength was in her ability to deal with pain, her tenacity, and her faith in people. Amara no longer felt alone. She knew there were people to support her, and more importantly, she could help others. The story of her fall and how Uncle James came to her rescue was only a starting point, but it lit a spark in her heart. Each day that spark grew bigger and bigger. Amara realized that her pain and suffering wasn't just a test, it was a lesson. She was ready to use her experiences to help others facing the same challenges. Inspired by all those who believed in her, she decided to become an activist. This was her new calling in life. She began working with youth who, like she once did, felt loneliness, prejudice, and discrimination. She looked for opportunities to fight for the rights of those who were ridiculed, those who were rejected by society. Amara realized that fighting for equality and justice was not just a slogan, but a daily job. She began to participate in various events where people gathered to discuss racism, sexism, and social injustice. She listened to other people's stories, shared her own, and saw how many there were who felt lost and forgotten. Each story, each meeting reinforced her decision that she should be the person to make the world a little better. One of the first steps she took was to set up a fund to help young people affected by discrimination and violence. She found support from people she met at the cafe, from colleagues who believed in her ideas, and from those who were willing to help. Together with them, Amara began to develop a project that would help adolescents and young people by giving them resources for education, psychotherapeutic help, and the opportunity to build their lives without stereotypes and prejudice. But that was just the beginning. Amara also became part of a movement that fought to pass laws protecting the rights of minorities. She didn't know the ins and outs of the political struggle, but she felt that her voice mattered. Every day her confidence grew, and she began to realize that she could influence people, society, and the future. Amara lectured in schools, telling teens her story and encouraging them not to give up in the face of bias. She showed them that they could be strong, that they were not alone in their experiences. There was a fire in her eyes that inspired people to believe in their own strength and in their ability to change their lives. As the months passed, Amara became not just a person who had experienced pain, but a symbol of change. She often met with young people, talking about her dreams, how important it was to fight for their rights, for equality, for everyone to be themselves. She also helped those who had experienced ridicule and prejudice, helping them to find the strength to move forward. Uncle James, who had once been her inspiration, was now there for her as a mentor and friend. He always reminded her that it's not just the winning that matters, but the journey you take. And if you help people, You are already becoming a winner. She saw respect in his eyes, and that meant the most to her. One warm evening, sitting in the cafe where she once worked, Amara reflected on her journey. She couldn't believe how much had happened in such a short time. She had been through some difficult moments, but now her life was filled with meaning. She realized that her story wasn't just about how she overcame adversity. It was a story about how each person can change their lives and how important it is to support each other in this difficult world. Amara thought about the future, which now seemed clearer. She knew that the fight for justice was not over, and that her actions could lead to real change. She had become someone who helped others not feel alone, someone who lifted up those who were at the bottom. Amara was ready to continue her work without stopping there. There was no room in her heart for fear, no room for doubt. She was ready for new challenges, new battles, and she knew she would not be alone in those battles. Because now she was part of something bigger than her own story. She was part of a movement for freedom, for equality, for justice. And with each day, with each new step, she believed more and more that the future she was building would be better for everyone. Thank you for your attention and for letting this story be a part of your day. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. See you again.